The storm had been building all afternoon, crawling in from the far end of Deep Hollow Canyon like a predator stalking its prey. By nightfall, the wind was a living thing, howling through the bare branches and slamming invisible fists against the rotting wood of the abandoned ranger outpost that Logan Trask now called home. Snow, thick as sifted flour, spilled from the sky, blurring the pines into ghostly shadows and burying the past under a hush so deep it swallowed even his thoughts. Inside, the cabin groaned under the weight of its own age. The tin roof ticked softly as it expanded and contracted with every change in wind. Logan sat hunched near the stove, one hand wrapped around a chipped enamel mug of coffee, the other resting on the back of an old mutt named Flint, who dozed with his muzzle twitching by the fire. The warmth inside was just enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay, but the silence was something else entirely, thick and endless, like a vacuum pressing against the walls. He wasn't a man who feared solitude. In fact, he'd chosen it. After everything, after the screams and sirens, after the sandstorms and the letter that had shattered what was left of his family, Logan had come here to disappear. And he had. For nearly 3 years, the world had left him alone, save for the occasional visit from a well-meaning deputy or a lost hiker too stubborn to admit they were lost. But tonight, something felt different. It started as a sound, faint, barely more than a breath in the wind. Logan stiffened, tilting his head toward the window where a sheet of frost turned the outside world into a dull blur. Flint's ears twitched, and the dog rose slowly, muscles rippling beneath his shaggy coat. The sound came again, a soft, broken whimper, then a hollow thud, and another. Hooves? Logan set his mug down and crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling aside the curtain with the edge of his coat sleeve. Through the warped glass, he could barely make out 2 shapes, dark, slow-moving, pressed against the old fence line about 20 yards from the porch. One was large, maybe 15 hands high, the other smaller, more fragile in its posture. Their breath steamed into the cold like ghosts, their heads low, legs unsteady. He didn't move at first. Wild horses didn't come this close to cabins, not even in the worst of weather. They were proud, untouchable things, creatures of the high ridges and remote mesas. For them to appear here, at his doorstep, in the middle of a whiteout. Something's wrong, he muttered under his breath. Flint let out a low chuff, as if to say, no kidding. Logan shrugged into his parka, yanked on his boots, and reached for the oil lantern that hung from a nail by the door. The wind hit him like a wave as he stepped outside, icy and relentless. He lifted the lantern high, the light casting long, distorted shadows through the snow. The 2 horses didn't flinch, didn't bolt. They just stood there, trembling. He moved toward the fence slowly, boots crunching through the knee-high drifts. The larger of the 2 lifted its head slightly. A chestnut mare, her mane matted with ice, her eyes dull but aware. The smaller one, a yearling by the look of it, was nearly down on its front knees, one hind leg twisted at a sickening angle. Logan's gut twisted. He hadn't tended to a horse in years, not since the rescue mission in Helmand, where they'd used Afghan ponies to cross terrain too rough for vehicles. But even without recent experience, he knew this colt wouldn't last the night out here. And the mare. He could see her ribs, the way she stood protectively in front of the younger one. She wasn't just cold, she was exhausted. He looked down at the latch on the old gate, rusted, nearly shut, and hesitated. Once he opened it, there was no going back. This place, this silence, had been his fortress. Letting them in meant breaking that. Letting them in meant caring again. The yearling let out a sound. A thin, aching cry that barely rose above the wind. It wasn't just a whinny, it was a plea. Logan swallowed hard and reached for the latch. The gate groaned open. The mare didn't move, but her ears flicked, tracking him. He knelt, setting the lantern down in the snow, and unwrapped a canvas feed sack he kept for emergencies. He scattered a few handfuls of hay and oats from the old storage bin near the shed, half frozen, but better than nothing. The yearling didn't come forward, but its nostrils flared. Logan kept his distance, backing toward the old lean-to that still offered some shelter from the wind. He left the gate wide, hoping they'd find the hay, hoping they'd trust enough to step through. Back inside, he stood at the window for nearly half an hour, eyes fixed on the silhouettes outside. Flint sat beside him, head on his paws. The wind howled, but the horses didn't leave. Eventually, the mare nudged the colt forward, slowly, painfully. They crossed the threshold of the fence. The colt nearly fell, but righted itself. They made their way toward the lean-to, collapsing there together in a heap of steam and frost and silence. That night, Logan couldn't sleep. Every crackle from the stove, every gust against the windows, made him sit up and listen. The whimpering had stopped, replaced by soft nickers, barely audible beneath the wind. At one point he stepped outside again, just long enough to drape a heavy wool blanket over the colt's back and tuck extra hay beneath their bellies. And then it happened, right before dawn, when the sky turned that strange steel-gray color just before the light breaks. He heard it. A low, strange sound, rising like a question from the darkness. Not from the colt, not even the mare, but from somewhere deeper in the canyon. A call, a response. The mare lifted her head sharply. Her ears pricked forward. The colt stirred. Logan stood in the doorway, half in the cabin, half out, heart thudding. They were calling, and someone, or something, was calling back. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared into the white, waiting. And when morning came, the storm finally broke. But something else had broken too. He stepped out into the light snowfall, boots crunching softly. And there, just beyond the edge of the fence, were footprints in the snow. Not hooves, boots. Someone had been watching them in the night. The frost hadn't yet melted from the pine needles when Logan spotted the prints again. Deeper now, clearer. He crouched beside them, running a calloused finger along the indentations in the snow. Standard hiking boots. Not military issue, but not amateur either. The stride was measured, the weight heavy on the heels. Whoever it was had lingered, possibly circling the pen before disappearing into the tree line north of the cabin. Flint stood behind him, tail stiff, ears pointed toward the timber. Logan didn't say a word. He'd spent too many years reading terrain under worse conditions, but this felt different. Not hostile, not yet, but deliberate. The horses were still where he'd left them, nestled under the lean-to, frost clinging to their coats like ash. The yearling's leg was swollen, but not bleeding, and the mare watched him with the same guarded alertness she'd shown the night before. Someone knew they were here, he muttered. He was halfway back to the cabin when Flint let out a single bark, sharp and low, and that's when he saw her. A figure in a hooded parka stood at the edge of the woods, not moving. The snow muted her presence, but not her purpose. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. Logan's instincts surged. His hand went unconsciously to his belt, where the sheath of a hunting knife sat. Not that he expected trouble, but solitude had a way of making you wary. The woman took a single step forward. "I'm not here to hurt them," she called, voice firm but calm. "Or you." He stayed where he was. "That right? Then tell me why you were out here last night." She lowered her hood. Naomi Keller wasn't what Logan expected. No older than mid-30s, dark curls escaping the wool cap pulled low over her forehead, eyes sharp and tired in the same breath. Her parka was covered in wind-swept ice, and she carried a field pack with a satellite antenna clipped to the side. "I'm Dr. Naomi Keller," she said, walking forward slowly. "Veterinarian. I work with the Mustang Preservation Alliance. I think you've got 2 of our missing horses." Logan crossed his arms. "You tracked them here?" She nodded. "We lost their signal 4 days ago. They're tagged with subdermal chips. One's a mare, alpha female from a band of 7. The other's a yearling. We think he's her colt." Logan didn't speak for a moment, weighing her. She didn't look like trouble, but he'd learned not to trust first impressions. The canyon had a way of stripping people to the bone. "Come on," he said finally, jerking his head toward the pen. "You can take a look." They walked through the thinning snowfall in silence, Flint circling warily around Naomi's legs. She offered her hand once, flat-palmed and slow, but Flint simply grumbled and trotted back to Logan's side. The mare inside the pen lifted her head the moment they neared, snorting softly. Naomi stopped short, eyes narrowing. "That's her." "Cassidy," she murmured. "God, I can't believe she made it this far." Logan watched her carefully. Naomi knelt near the fence, her breath fogging the air. Her eyes shifted to the colt, still curled beneath the lean-to, leg stretched awkwardly to the side. "Swelling's worse," she muttered. "Possibly a sprain, maybe a fracture. If we don't get him under care soon, the cold could kill him." Logan frowned. "I wrapped it, gave him hay, water, shelter." "You've done a hell of a lot more than most," Naomi said, looking up at him. "But this is beyond what a cabin and a first aid kit can handle." Before he could answer, tires crunched in the snow behind them. Logan turned, jaw tightening as a sheriff's vehicle pulled up the narrow path. The familiar blue light on the dash flicked off as the driver stepped out. Deputy Rex Caldwell was a tall, stone-faced man with a badge that never shined, and a voice that carried suspicion like a second weapon. He shut the door hard, snow kicking up under his boots. "Didn't expect company, Trask," Rex said, glancing between Logan and Naomi. "Neither did I," Logan replied coolly. Rex's eyes shifted to the horses. "Those yours?" "They're not," Logan answered. "But they're not feral either. She says they're tagged, belong to some conservation group." Naomi stood, brushing snow from her knees. "Dr. Naomi Keller. I'm with the Mustang Preservation Alliance. We've been tracking these 2 for days." Rex didn't shake her hand. "And what brings you to an ex-military cabin without alerting local authorities?" "Because I didn't know I'd end up here," she shot back, her tone calm but clipped. "I spotted them near this ridge, circled around, found their trail." Rex shifted his weight. "Logan, you sure you want to get involved in this? You've had enough on your plate the past few years." Logan felt the old burn of judgment rise in his chest. "You think I should have let them freeze out there?" "I think this place was meant to be your piece, not another battlefield." Naomi stepped in. "Deputy, with all due respect, I didn't come here to start anything. But that colt's not going to survive another night without help." Rex glanced at the pen one more time. "Fine, but you call me if this turns into a liability. Last thing this canyon needs is people dragging more wild into the wild." He turned, without waiting for a reply, boots grinding back across the snow, and drove off without another word. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. Naomi turned back toward the horses. "We have to get them out of here." Logan exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "There's a frozen creek about 5 miles west. Flat enough for a sled if we rig one. We've got a recovery team set up near Cedar Ledge. If we can reach them, they can bring in transport." Logan nodded once. "Then we better start packing." And that's when the mare froze, ears stiff, head turned sharply east. From the ridge beyond the tree line, a third shadow emerged, thin, limping, watching. Another horse. Logan's stomach dropped. The shape moved like smoke. Barely there, barely holding itself up. It didn't cry out, it didn't step forward, it simply stood. Naomi's breath caught. "That's not one of ours," she whispered. "Not tagged. But it's been following them." Logan stepped forward, narrowing his eyes. "No," he murmured. "It's been looking for them." And in the drifting snow, the third Mustang lowered its head, just a little, and began to walk toward the fence. The third horse didn't come close at first. It lingered just beyond the frost-bitten trees, legs trembling beneath a skeletal frame barely held together by will and instinct. Its coat, once likely a rich bay or dun, was now dulled by ice and starvation, streaked with frozen mud, flanks hollowed from exhaustion. But what struck Logan the most wasn't the limp, or even the quiet desperation in its eyes. It was the way it looked past him, past Naomi, straight at the pen where the mare and colt stood. Recognition. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. No thunder of hooves or piercing cry, just a flick of the ear from the mare, a shift in her stance. And then, almost imperceptibly, a sound from her chest. Not a whinny, not a nicker, but something in between. A low, guttural note that Logan had never heard a horse make. Not until last night. Not until the wind had gone still and that whimpering cry had pierced the storm. Naomi moved first, stepping forward, but Logan held out an arm. Not yet. The stallion, or perhaps older colt, it was hard to tell in its condition, shifted its weight, attempting a step. The front left leg gave out. It didn't cry out, didn't rear or kick. It simply folded and crumpled, one leg tucked under, chest heaving from the effort. Naomi drew a slow breath. "We have to go to him." Logan looked at the lean-to, where the younger colt was now on his feet, barely. The mare pressed her muzzle against her foal's side protectively, her eyes locked on the fallen Mustang beyond the fence. "That's family," Naomi whispered. Logan didn't need convincing. He grabbed the sled gear he'd kept stored in the old shed, slung a heavy wool blanket over one shoulder, and motioned for Naomi to follow. By the time they reached the injured horse, its breathing had slowed into something fragile, shallow. It didn't move as they approached, didn't flinch. Logan knelt beside it, placing a gloved hand gently against the side of its neck. Still warm, barely. Naomi crouched on the other side, her hand moving swiftly to the front leg. "Possible dislocation," she murmured. "Maybe just a severe strain, no compound fracture. If it were broken, we'd see it." Logan nodded. "We have to move now, before it gives up entirely." It took everything they had. Naomi slid the blanket beneath its torso while Logan positioned the sled close. They used a soft, padded sling to cradle the torso without dragging the injured limb. It was a brutal operation in sub-zero air, snow swirling around them in gusts. Logan's arms trembled, not from the cold, but the effort of not making a mistake. One wrong movement and the horse would either bolt or collapse completely. But it didn't. It didn't fight. It didn't run. It let them lift it, shift it, strap it down. It let them save it. By the time they got it to the pen, the mare was pacing. The colt let out a strained sound that made Naomi glance over her shoulder. Logan undid the latch and slowly pulled the sled inside. The mare backed up a few steps, then pressed forward, ears flicking, muscles taut. "She knows," Naomi said softly. "That's not just instinct." The moment they eased the injured horse into the straw, the mare stepped forward, nostrils flaring. She sniffed along his neck, then down the length of his injured leg. Her posture relaxed, only slightly, but it was there. Reunion. The colt limped forward too, nuzzling the side of the new arrival's face. And finally, a sound, so soft Logan barely heard it. A nicker from the injured stallion. Weak, rasped, but unmistakably alive. Naomi exhaled shakily. You were right. They weren't just following him, he was following them. Later, inside the cabin, Logan poured hot water into a dented metal mug, while Naomi scribbled notes in her field journal. She sat at the corner of his rickety table, boots still caked with snow, her parka steaming in the heat. I called Ranger Navarro, she said, not looking up. He and Ellie are about 6 miles south prepping the rescue transport. Once the storm clears, they'll move this way. Logan nodded slowly. He'd heard the name before, Luis Navarro, former ranger, now half conservationist, half ghost story in these parts. And Ellie? Naomi smiled faintly. Tech-savvy, headstrong, probably half your age and twice as annoying. But she'd walk barefoot through a blizzard if it meant saving a horse. Logan leaned against the counter, rubbing his jaw. Sounds like she'll fit in. Naomi closed her notebook. They'll meet us at the lower ridge near the ice fall. We'll have to move them, slowly. But we can't wait more than a day, the storm's shifting. Logan glanced at the window. Outside, the clouds were thickening again, wind teasing the snow into spirals across the open yard. Another front? Looks like it. He sighed, watching Flint curl near the stove. The dog hadn't barked once during the rescue. He'd just sat, alert, like he understood what this moment was. They're gonna need more shelter than that lean-to tonight, Logan muttered. Naomi stood, her gaze lingering on the fire. Then we build one. It took the rest of the afternoon, using tarps, broken boards, bales of straw, and what little rope they had. Logan and Naomi constructed a makeshift tent beside the pen, a windbreak strong enough to keep the worst of the storm out. By dusk, the snow had started again in earnest. Naomi moved between the 3 horses, checking the leg of the youngest, rewrapping the injured stallion's limb with a firmer bandage. The mare, Cassidy as Naomi had called her, never strayed far from either. Later, as they huddled by the fire, boots steaming and fingers raw, Logan looked across the room at Naomi. You said Navarro was 6 miles south. She nodded. You trust him? With my life. Logan stared into the flames for a long time, then said, Then tomorrow, we ride. Naomi leaned back in her chair, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion. And if the storm hits before we make it? Logan didn't smile, but his voice softened. Then we shelter. Together. Outside, in the makeshift pen blanketed by snow, 3 horses lay pressed against each other, bodies forming a quiet, imperfect circle. Not broken, not yet whole, but surviving, just like him. The first howl of wind came just after midnight, low and distant like a far-off freight train threading through the jagged mouth of Deep Hollow Canyon. Logan Trask had been half asleep, boots still on, one hand resting on the rifle beside his cot, the other dangling over the edge where Flint lay, curled up and alert. He knew the sound well, knew the shift in the tone that meant this wasn't just wind brushing through the pines. This was a front, a heavy one. Naomi was already at the door when he sat up, tying her parka, lantern swinging at her hip. It's coming early, she said grimly. Logan didn't answer. He pulled on his coat, grabbed the second tarp and the 2 coils of rope, and followed her out into the dark. The air was bitter and wet, thick with the scent of incoming snow. The moon had vanished behind a bruised wall of clouds, and the stars were nothing more than faint smudges in the sky. In the pen, the 3 horses stirred uneasily. Cassidy, the mare, was already on her feet, ears twitching at the rising noise. The colt, now called Jasper, leaned into her for warmth. The stallion, still too weak to stand long, lifted his head as Logan and Naomi approached, nostrils flaring. "We have to anchor the side," Naomi shouted over the rising wind, motioning to the makeshift shelter they had thrown together from scavenged boards, snow fencing, and canvas. "If it peels off, it'll rip open like a tin can." Logan drove a stake into the frozen earth with the heel of his boot, muscles burning. Naomi cinched the rope down tight and secured the last corner of the tarp over the frame. The horses shifted closer together, instinct driving them to create warmth. Bodies pressed so tightly it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began. Cassidy nosed the stallion's flank, then moved to shield Jasper from the wind, wrapping herself into a crescent moon shape. The stallion, despite the tremble in his legs, shuffled closer, resting his weight against both. "They're forming a circle," Naomi murmured, crouching down to adjust the blanket on Jasper's back. "They're doing what wild herds do in the worst storms, protecting each other." Logan crouched beside her, wind whipping strands of snow-crusted hair across his face. "Smart creatures," he muttered. "Smarter than half the people I knew in uniform." They stayed like that for minutes, maybe longer, neither speaking, just watching as the snow began to fall harder, driven sideways, coating the shelter in a fast-thickening layer of white. The canvas walls rattled like sails, threatening to rip loose with every gust. Eventually, Logan nudged Naomi's arm. "We need to get inside. If the canvas goes, we'll need to replace it fast." They stumbled back to the outpost, half blind in the blizzard. Flint greeted them with a low whine, tail thumping once against the floor. Inside, the warmth from the stove was thin and flickering. Logan added 2 more logs and stoked the fire to life again. Naomi unwrapped her scarf, her cheeks pink with cold. She sat near the fire, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes distant. After a moment, Logan poured 2 mugs of black coffee, handed her one, and sat across from her. "You ever think about quitting this work?" he asked. Naomi looked up slowly. "You mean animal rescue?" "Yeah." She shook her head. "I've thought about quitting a lot of things, but never this." He stared into the fire, then said, "I lost a boy. 6 years old, Drew, my son." Naomi's hand stopped mid-sip. Logan didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the embers as he spoke, voice low and even. "Car crash. My wife was driving. Black ice down near the salt flats. She walked away with a broken wrist. He didn't." Silence stretched between them. "I stayed in the Air Force after that," Logan said. "Volunteered for back-to-back tours. Desert, jungle, anywhere but here. Couldn't stand the quiet." Naomi said nothing, but her eyes never left his face. "This place—" He motioned to the walls around them, the cracked linoleum, the rusted stove, the faded ranger station insignia. "It's the only place I found where I didn't expect to hear his voice when I walked in the door." Naomi set her mug down. "I'm sorry, Logan." He nodded once. "I thought I was done with people. Done with feeling anything." She leaned back, folding her arms over her knees. "I get it." He glanced up, eyebrow raised. "My first rescue was a group of Mustangs trapped in a mudslide outside Ely," she said. 3 adults, 2 foals. The smallest one, barely standing. I stayed with him all night. Covered him with a tarp, whispered to him. In the morning, he was dead." She took a breath, blinking fast. "I told myself I'd never do it again, never get close. But then the next storm came and I went back out." Outside, the wind screamed against the walls. The horses stirred, hooves scraping faintly against the frozen ground. "Why'd you go back?" Logan asked. "Because something in their eyes said, 'Don't leave us here.' And I knew what that felt like." They sat in silence for a while longer, the kind of silence that had weight to it, like a blanket drawn between two people who no longer needed to speak every word aloud. At first light, if it could be called that through the thick veil of gray, Logan rose. He pulled on his gloves, nodded toward the pen. Time to move. The wind hadn't stopped, but it had weakened. The worst of the front had passed, leaving behind deep drifts and brittle cold. The trees groaned under the weight of fresh snow, their limbs heavy with ice. Logan loaded supplies onto Charlie, the snowmobile he'd kept alive with scrap parts and stubbornness. Naomi helped rig the sled with bales of straw, an emergency kit, and another canvas roll for the horses. Together, they led the mare and Jasper toward the sled. The stallion lagged behind at first, but Cassidy wouldn't leave him. She circled back, touched her nose to his flank, and waited. Logan stepped in, speaking low, steady words. "Come on, boy, we're not leaving you." It took time, and all the patience they had left. But eventually, the stallion moved. Each step was a test of balance, but he kept going, guided more by trust than strength. By the time they cleared the last drift, Luis Navarro and Ellie Burke were waiting near the ridge, bundled against the cold, eyes wide at the sight of the trio. Luis stepped forward, mouth drawn tight with surprise. "You weren't kidding," he said to Naomi. "They really are a bonded group." Ellie grinned. "Told you it'd take a miracle to bring them in. Looks like you brought the miracle." But Logan didn't hear them. Atop the next hill, barely visible through the mist, stood 5 more Mustangs. Silent, still, their heads raised, ears flicked forward. Cassidy stopped in her tracks. She let out a sound that wasn't a whinny, wasn't a cry. It was deeper, older, the sound of recognition across distance. From the hill, one Mustang answered. The stallion beside Logan raised his head, eyes alight. Naomi stepped beside him, whispering, "They found us." And Logan stood there in the middle of a frozen nowhere, wind howling past, heart pounding in his chest like a war drum, and realized this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The air that morning was still sharp, but it had lost the violent bite of the days before. Sunlight filtered weakly through a patchwork sky, illuminating deep hollow canyon with a pallid gold that glinted off icicles and powdered ridgelines. At the Mustang Rescue Station, nestled beneath a cliff wall dusted in frost, 3 horses stood beneath the covered corral, no longer trembling, no longer uncertain. They were alive, healing. Jasper's limp had faded into a ginger step. Cassidy, the mare, no longer startled at human approach. And the stallion, now called Flint, after Logan's old shepherd, had begun to pace with quiet energy, ears always pricked toward the wind. As if listening, Naomi had confirmed what Logan already suspected. The trio wasn't just a fluke of survival. They were kin. Blood. A mother, her young son, and an older sibling or father. Separated in the storm, nearly broken by it, but now whole again. Logan leaned on the paddock fence that morning, steam curling from the coffee mug in his gloved hands. Ellie bustled behind him, stringing hay bales and checking heat lamps with her usual blur of nervous energy. "You know," she said, brushing snow off her sleeves, "for a guy who didn't want any part of this in the beginning, you've become a bit of a Mustang whisperer." Logan didn't answer right away. He watched as Jasper bent down to nuzzle a pile of straw, then turned to bump shoulders with Flint. Cassidy stood nearby, watching them with a kind of maternal pride. A family restored. I didn't plan to be here, he said finally, voice low. Didn't plan for any of it. But you stayed, Ellie said, gentler now. That counts. A truck rumbled up the icy service road, Naomi's ride back from a morning briefing with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. When she stepped down, clipboard under one arm, Logan could tell by her face that things were moving faster than expected. They're ready, she said simply. Weather looks good for the next 36 hours. The rest of the herd was spotted near Spring Ridge, just 6 miles west. She handed Logan the clipboard, where a short authorization form was clipped to the front. Release scheduled for tomorrow. We bring them in early, let them acclimate, and when we open that gate, they go, he finished. Naomi nodded, back where they belong. The day passed in quiet preparation. Volunteers patted straw into the transport trailer, checked brake lines, and adjusted harnesses to make the journey as smooth as possible. Logan spent the afternoon brushing Cassidy's coat, removing burrs and ice mats by hand. She didn't flinch. Flint followed him like a silent shadow, eyes always steady, as if memorizing every detail of Logan's scent, his movements. That night, Logan didn't sleep. Not from worry, he had nothing left to fear, but from something that felt almost like restlessness. He walked the perimeter of the corral under the stars, pausing to watch the Mustangs as they lay in their circle again. Jasper curled tight, Flint's head resting atop his neck, Cassidy facing outward like a sentinel. At dawn, they loaded the horses. It was quiet, peaceful, no panic, no resistance, as if they understood. Naomi rode in the front of the trailer, hand resting lightly on the rail. Ellie drove the second support truck. Logan sat in the cab next to the volunteer driver, the old road unspooling before them like a path laid out by something larger than coincidence. They reached Spring Ridge before noon. The sun was high, bright enough to make the snow glisten, warm enough to feel real. And waiting there, across a shallow basin of windswept white, stood the rest of the herd. 6 Mustangs, including a lead stallion, 2 yearlings, and a dun-coated mare with a blaze like lightning across her nose. Cassidy's head shot up the moment she stepped out of the trailer. Her ears flicked forward. Jasper let out a short, broken whinny that cracked in his throat, but the response came instantly. 3 horses from the ridge perked their heads and answered with cries that echoed like song. Naomi looked at Logan. "You ready?" "No," he said honestly. "But they are." She stepped forward and unlatched the gate. At first, they stood still, Flint tense, Jasper hesitant. Then Cassidy moved. With one smooth step, she pushed forward, nudging Jasper ahead, her body angling protectively. Flint followed without a sound. They crossed the snow in slow arcs at first, then faster, as if pulled by memory. Logan's breath caught when the lead stallion broke from the herd, charging down the hill in thunderous grace. The Mustangs met in a swirl of motion and sound, nuzzling, nickering, rearing in short bursts of joy and recognition. Jasper pranced around the others, his once-injured leg now forgotten in the exuberance. Flint circled Cassidy, who whinnied loud and long, echoing off the ridgelines. "They're home," Naomi whispered. But Logan didn't move. Not until Jasper, halfway up the rise, eyes shining in the sun, stopped and turned. For a long moment, the young colt just stared at him. No sound, no motion, just a stillness that felt holy. Then Jasper dipped his head. A single, slow nod. Logan smiled. "Yeah," he murmured. "You're good now." And with that, Jasper wheeled and galloped after the others, his form vanishing into the snow-laced wild. Later that week, Ellie handed Logan a photo she'd taken the night of the storm. The 3 horses curled together in the makeshift shelter, breathing as one. "I thought you'd want to keep this," she said. He nodded, quietly tucked it into his coat. He didn't return to town, not yet. Instead, he went back to the old ranger station. He fixed the door that winter had nearly broken, repaired the fencing, cleared the snow from the roof. Day by day, he reclaimed it, not as a place to hide, but as something new. Months passed. Spring whispered through the canyon in green bursts and thawed rivers. Wildflowers bloomed along the fence lines. Birds returned. And then, one morning, while Logan was out gathering wood, he heard hooves. A band of Mustangs crossed the edge of his field, 7 of them, wild and swift. Cassidy was there. Flint, strong and sleek, turned his head for just a second. And Jasper stopped. For a heartbeat, he looked at Logan. Then he nodded again and ran. Logan stood still, hand over his heart, and smiled like a man finally home.